Good morning and welcome to Monday Mornings with Margie. Thanks for being here and listening to what we have to share. I have Karen Mackey here, and she will be sharing with us what she does for work, and then we will be discussing the recent SCOTUS ruling on sexual orientation and gender identity being protected under the Civil Rights Act. So Karen, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, well, I'm the Executive Director of the Sioux City Human Rights Commission. I've been here about 16 years. We're a local civil rights law enforcement agency in Iowa. There's actually a state law that any city with a population over 29,000 has to have a human rights commission. They don't necessarily have to have paid staff, but they at least have to have a commission. So there has been a commission here since the 1960s, and since the very early 70s, there's been paid staff. So I think, the fourth director of the Human Rights Commission. We tend to stay here a while once we land in this job. So what we do here then is investigate allegations of discrimination based on a variety of areas: employment, education, public accommodation, housing, and credit. But most of the work we do is in employment law.
Okay. So I would imagine that the recent ruling directly impacts the work you're doing or the people you're working with. I know Iowa was a state that was already had protections, but I know that we spoke about neighboring states that did not have the same kind of protections. And with that, I just want to share this map that we can speak to, that, I was even surprised looking at this, that all the purple states are states that prior to this ruling protected people based on sexual orientation and gender identity. But any of the gray states had no protections, and the other, various shades of people had certain protections, either just for sexual orientation or just for sexual orientation in public employees. So I think it's pretty striking, and it's interesting for people to be able to see this. So how does this recent ruling affect the work you're doing, and do you want to speak a little bit about the ruling at all?
I will. Well, I'll first start with the impact here. We actually live in a tri-state area, so I can travel 5 minutes and I am either in Nebraska or South Dakota. So a lot of people work in one state, live in another. So you could have a scenario of someone who lives in Sioux City, where I work here, where we would have jurisdiction if it was an employment situation, for example, but maybe they worked in Nebraska or South Dakota, and if they were fired due to their sexual orientation, actual or perceived sexual orientation or gender identity, but they worked in Nebraska or South Dakota, I would have to explain to them that I was very sorry, but there was nothing anyone could do for them. It was perfectly legal to discriminate against them. And sadly, I've had to tell people that more often than I would like, frankly, over the years. So this sort of evens the playing field. Now we don't have this checkerboard of employment protection.
Sure.
So that is a good thing. The case was interesting. There were actually 3 different complaining parties: 2 gay men and a transgender woman. And actually, 2 of them passed away before the decision was rendered.
Oh.
So the 3 were Gerald Bostic, who had been a longtime child welfare advocate in Georgia. He was a gay man.
Mm-hmm.
And he was fired once he joined a gay softball league. And that became public knowledge. Each of these people was terminated simply because of either their sexual orientation or gender identity. So in the case of Donald Zarda, he was a skydiving instructor, and he had worked for a company for a number of years, had done a good job, and casually mentioned he was gay. And that was the end of his employment relationship with that company. And the third individual was Amy Stevens, who had worked for a funeral home for a number of years. I think she'd been there about 6 years. And during the course of that time had been undergoing mental health therapy, and finally was coming to terms with the fact that she was transgender. And the recommendation for her mental health was that she needed to start presenting as a woman and start the process of transitioning. Mm-hmm. And I think we all know the high risk of people in the transgender community of committing suicide, really struggling with a lot of issues regarding their gender identity. And so this individual did make the decision that she would start presenting as a female. She had a vacation already set up and wrote the owners of the business a letter, explained that when she returned from vacation, she would be presenting as a female full-time. And they told her that just wouldn't work out, and they fired her. Wow. So it was very clear in all three of these cases that the people were terminated simply because of either their gender identity or their sexual orientation. So there were very clear-cut cases in that respect. One of the things I found interesting about the case was who wrote the case. It's Gorsuch. And the chief judge was actually on the prevailing side. As such, Chief Justice Roberts would have had the decision to make about who writes the decision. And that's always an interesting little bit of politics. Mm-hmm. And I think Roberts was sending a message by having Gorsuch write it. Mm-hmm. I think that was a surprise to a lot of us. But it also is another way of when you have someone who ordinarily wouldn't be on the side that they've landed on, it solidifies them if they're writing the opinion.
Sure. Sure.
So that was an interesting little bit of politicking. Yeah. And it's funny, whenever I read a decision, I always also read the dissents. Mm-hmm. And the dissents were interesting. I do have to say that just whining, a lot of whining, it seemed. Mm-hmm. But Gorsuch talked about textualist interpretation, that you have to, normally you look at the meaning of the terms in a law at the time it was enacted. And so the opinion and the dissents really are an argument about what sex means. Mm-hmm. Right. And I think those of us in the LGBTQ community have understood for a long time that sex is more than your biological gender. Right. Right. And that it's a whole constellation of things that make up who I am as a female. Sure. And what that means to be female for me. And does that comport with what society thinks about who is a female? And society's view of femininity or masculinity has changed over time. Mm-hmm. But anyhow, so that's what I found fascinating about the case. Really, was that's what it turns on. Really, is what does sex mean? Right.
Right. It's interesting because I was looking at the Human Rights Campaign website, and one of the statistics was about half of members of the LGBTQ community do not disclose at work anything about their sexual orientation or gender identity. And I was thinking about that sort of in the larger context of how do we as people manage stress, manage our mental health, manage how to be our best selves or our authentic selves, and both the benefits and repercussions, potential repercussions of living an authentic life. And, you know, so I was thinking mental health perspective wise, for many people in this community, including myself, when you're discovering who you are as a person and going through all the different aspects of identity, often what the decision comes to are three separate options. There's one of sort of choosing to live a disingenuous life, or sort of a lie if you want to say it directly. There's choosing to live an authentic life as who you are and know you are. And then for some people, there is the choice that neither seems like a good option, and so they make a choice to end their life, which you were talking about as far as trans, you know, it high percentage, and it's the same with LGBTQ, especially youth. There's a higher percentage that actually choose to end their life. And so when you think about those options, all of them come with a large amount of stress and impact on one's mental health.
Yes.
I wanted to hear some of your thoughts around that.
You know, I think this decision is going to be helpful in the long term, because I think it helps alleviate some, but not all of that pain. I was, as you were talking, I was thinking back to when I was first hired into this position. So I've been out since I was 19. I'm in my 60s, so I've been out a long time. Sioux City is a community of about 83,000 people. So it can feel like a very small town at times. But I had the decision to make when I applied for the job. Am I going to be my real self? Am I going to continue to be out as a lesbian? Knowing the pitfalls that might lie ahead, because at that point, Iowa did not protect people based on sexual orientation or gender identity. And there have been occasional problems, because there are people who make assumptions, have their own narrow view of how they view people. But, you know, I was also getting that for being Native American, for being mixed race. So it's, in some respects, it's kind of all the same. But, you know, this decision does not mean that that's all going to go away, but it means that you have a legal framework for trying to protect yourself if need be. And I think that's going to be so beneficial to people. You know, I think about some of the folks I've dealt with over the years who just really struggle to be their authentic selves. And there really are those three choices, or that's how it feels to people. To be your authentic self, to live a lie, or to kill yourself. And sometimes those first two carry with them so much pain that they feel the only way out is to commit suicide.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is just so sad. I think, though, with the teenagers and people in their young 20s, I think times are changing,
Mm-hmm.
and they are much freer to be their authentic self.
Mm-hmm.
But that still is a struggle for people, especially people who come from conservative families, come from religious backgrounds that are not supportive of LGBTQ people.
Mm-hmm.
It really can be a struggle. I have found it shocking at times, the hurtful ways families can treat their children. I'm a part of a grassroots LGBT organization here, Siouxland Pride Alliance. And every year, in the winter, of course, and we have harsh winters, end up dealing with at least a couple of kids who have been kicked to the curb.
Mm-hmm.
I remember last year there were 2 girls who were partnered, and they had been thrown out, and it was like literally the coldest nights in the year. We had a wind chill of like -50,
Mm-hmm.
and they were trying to sleep in their car.
Mm-hmm.
And thank God, though, they had a teacher. One of them had a teacher who she knew was supportive, and reached out to that teacher and called him and explained the situation. And his wife is a teacher as well. So they were trying to figure out what to do. Ultimately, they paid for a hotel room for that night for the girls, and then thought the next day, well, the local gospel mission, they're our homeless shelter, let's take them there, not knowing that the gospel mission will not accept anyone who's LGBTQ.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're turned away at the door, and ultimately the 2 teachers took these 2 girls in
Mm-hmm.
for about a month while they figured things out.
Mm-hmm.
But, I don't know what would have happened to those kids if one of them hadn't thought to call her teacher and had her teacher's phone number for whatever reason.
Sure. And one of the things that I'm going to do at the end of this podcast and YouTube video is to present resources for people, because I think it's important for people to know when you are feeling isolated and you are feeling like you have these 3 decisions, and we really want people not to choose number 3. We want them to really hone in on number 2 and find the ways that they can be their most authentic self and be their best self in their life. But people can't do it without supports, and knowing that there's resources and knowing there are other people out there that will help them and guide them or understand what they're going through. So it's important for me to put, some of these resources out so that people know that there are options. And one thing I found for LGBTQ youth is called the Trevor Project. And I hadn't heard of that, but it's, it targets, youth who up to age 25, I think, who are struggling with depression and suicide and feeling isolated. So I am going to present a list of resources so that, people know that there's help and that there's people out there that care and that they, they have a chance to live a good life. And I think that's important for people to know.
That's good. Sexual orientation and gender identity differs from race in one, I think, very important aspect. So I am mixed race. My father's Native American, my mother's white. My parents married in 1954. It just wasn't done back then. But as I was growing up, I occasionally faced some discrimination or mistreatment by other kids. And we lived in a part of this community that's very white. When I graduated from high school, I was one of about a dozen minority kids out of 350 students.
Wow.
Yes. So very white. It's still the whitest part of town here. But so when I would face problems growing up, my father certainly understood. My mother understood. She understood in a different way. Mm-hmm. But she made the choice to marry outside of her race. And so she faced some of the same issues. She understood both, like my entire family understood. Now, my white grandmother, that side of the family really didn't get it, but everyone else in my family understood and could support me and lift me up and tell me not to listen to those idiots. And I was just fine the way I was. Mm-hmm. When you're an LGBTQ kid, you very likely don't have that in your family. Mm-hmm. So the thing where I felt apart from my family was as a teenager, knowing I was a lesbian. I wasn't out yet, but knowing I was a lesbian, it just, it caused a rift in my family. As something that I created, that I just stepped back and was not as involved with my family and was doing things like thinking about suicide, thinking of that third way out, because I could not perceive that I was going to be able to live a life as my real authentic self. So the options were to live a lie or to kill myself. Mm-hmm. Luckily, I decided that killing myself was not an option for me. And ultimately, I decided that for my own mental health, I had to be out, regardless of the consequences. Mm-hmm. And eventually my family came along. They were fine. Mm-hmm. It took a while.
Yeah.
But it was great. And 10 years ago, when same-sex marriage became legal in Iowa, my partner and I married. And we held it on the weekend that the native side of my family ordinarily has their reunion, their family reunion. And so I did that. So that was the family reunion that year. And they were all there. It was a very full church. My spouse comes from a very large family too. And she really had issues about, although they all knew she was gay, she didn't talk about it. Mm-hmm. It was a don't ask, don't tell thing. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, almost everyone in the family was there. We had so many family there, we barely had room for friends.
Well, and that's good. I mean, I think that's what people need to understand, is that even when it feels like you're boxed in, that there are supports and resources, and some of it is about the people who are struggling around you. It takes time for them to adjust and understand and educate themselves. Not in every case. We know that's not in every case, but I think it's becoming more of a norm where people may struggle, parents, siblings, family may struggle, but over time they come along. And the other piece is, I think, for some people, their friends become their family. And so, we are born into families, but sometimes those families can't support us. I'm fortunate that that's not been my experience, but for people that it is their experience, it's important to know that you can develop and create a new supportive family when that isn't an option within your biological or the people who raised you. So I think these are all huge topics, and we could probably talk about this for a long time. Say that again?
Yes, probably to go on forever. But family of choice is a very important support.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So I want to thank you for taking the time to talk with me about this important issue, and in some ways very hopeful topic, even though we've talked about the struggles, we're also looking at the progress that's being made. And, I think we got to focus on both. How do we support the struggle, and how do we keep progressing and building more hope for our community? So thank you for the work you do every day, and thank you for sharing with me both your professional and your personal life experience today. I think it's helpful for people to hear this.
Well, thank you very much for contacting me and allowing me to do this. This has been great, and thank you for the work you are doing.
Thank you. All right, so we're going to wrap up Monday Mornings with Margie. I hope you all have a great week and be well.